There's no denying that vintage cars have a unique charm and simplicity that modern vehicles can only dream of. But let's be real, driving some of these vehicles was sometimes like driving a fast-moving death trap. Join us in this video as we revisit some of the 10 dangerous old car features that no longer exist. We'll be kicking things off with the metal dashboards. Back in the early days, cars weren't concerned with padding or soft touches. Instead, they had dashboards made of cold, hard steel that stretched across the front of the cabin like a barricade. For automakers, it was more about practicality than safety. These dashboards housed the essential dials, switches, and maybe a radio if you were lucky. However, the main problem with this feature was in accidents. When that fortress of metal turned into a weapon, there were no airbags or even basic padding, so the force of impact against the dashboard could be devastating. Car companies like Ford and Chevrolet continued to use metal dashboards well into the 1950s and 60s, despite growing awareness of their dangers. The tipping point came when safety advocates and crash tests revealed just how lethal these dashboards could be. Engineers began to add padding, and eventually the cold steel gave way to the cushioned, impact-absorbing materials we see today. Thankfully, the days of rigid dashboards are long gone, leaving us to wonder how anyone made it through the era of driving with what was essentially a steel wall in front of them. Next up is the non-collapsible steering columns. For decades, steering wheels had a dark side. Well, the column behind them did. Early cars featured non-collapsible steering columns, which meant that in the event of a crash, the steering column stayed rigid. Imagine getting into an accident and, instead of just dealing with the impact, you're suddenly faced with a spear aimed right into your chest. In the mid-20th century, automakers like Ford, Chevrolet, and Chrysler equipped their cars with these steering columns. At the time, nobody thought much about it. After all, the focus was more on making cars bigger and faster. But as cars got faster and crashes became more frequent, the danger became impossible to ignore. The solution? A collapsible steering column that would, as the name suggests, collapse inward upon impact, absorbing some of the force and protecting the driver from being crushed. General Motors led the way in 1967 by introducing the first collapsible steering columns, and it quickly became a standard feature across the industry. Come to think of it, it sounds insane that anyone thought a fixed metal column pointed at the driver's chest would be a good idea. I guess it's safe to say automakers in the early years were basically testing just about anything to see what would work and stand the test of time. The swing-away steering wheels are proof of this. If you thought getting into your car today could be a bit of a squeeze, imagine how people felt in the 1960s. Back then, cars were big, but getting into the car wasn't usually easy. Most automakers thought they found the holy grail for the problem, the swing-away steering wheel. This weird innovation introduced by Ford in models like the Thunderbird allowed the steering wheel to turn out of the way when the door was opened. The idea was simple: give the driver a little more room to slide into their seat. It seemed like a brilliant idea at first, smooth, stylish, and a bit sophisticated. But as with many ambitious automotive experiments, things didn't quite go as planned. The mechanisms that controlled the swing were prone to malfunction. There were instances where the wheel wouldn't swing back into place, trapping drivers or leaving them stranded in awkward positions. By the 1970s, safety regulations were becoming strict, and features like the swing-away steering wheel started to fade. After all, convenience is great, but not when it comes at the cost of being able to steer the car properly. By the mid-20th century, car makers were still trying all kinds of tricks to make vehicles safer, or at least look safer. This was when the water balloon bumper idea stuck. It might sound like a prank gone wrong, but at one point, some very serious automotive minds thought the answer to crash safety was in filling bumpers with water. In theory, it wasn't a bad idea. Water is pretty good at absorbing energy, so the idea was that in a crash, these bumpers would squish, the water would spread out, and the occupants would be spared the worst of the collision's force. Companies like Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors even experimented with these liquid bumpers. But when it comes to practicality, it was useless. The bumper tended to leak, crack, or burst altogether. And when they did manage to hold up, they were practically useless in high-speed crashes. It didn't help that, in the general public, these bumpers looked a bit odd. After all, they resembled big, water-filled bladders stuck to the front and back of the car. People were understandably skeptical about their effectiveness, and frankly, these bumpers did little to prove them wrong. By the time the 1970s rolled around, water balloon bumpers were the stuff of history books. replaced by solid bumper materials, and eventually the high-tech crumple zones we see today. While water balloon bumpers on their own weren't dangerous, the wrist twist steering control was a recipe for disaster in the 60s. You'll agree with us that it makes absolutely no sense to buy a car without a steering wheel. However, in the 1960s, Ford decided to shake things up with an experimental design that sounded too odd to be true. The wrist twist steering feature was so odd, it almost sounded made up. Instead of a regular steering wheel, Mercury Park Lane convertible models were equipped with two twistable dials, like motorcycle handlebars, meant to revolutionize the way people steered. The idea was that by twisting these handles, drivers could control the direction of the car more intuitively. Well, in theory at least. At first glance, this wrist twist system seemed innovative, if not a little strange. Unlike a conventional steering wheel that blocks part of the dash, these twisty dials allowed for a clear view of the dashboard. They were meant to make entry and exit easier since there was no big wheel in the way. However, the problem of the system soon became apparent, especially to drivers who'd grown up on traditional steering wheels. Trying to steer with two dials instead of one wheel was confusing, requiring drivers to thumb and ring their way through turns. Imagine trying to steer a car with two big bottle caps. The wrist twist dials didn't offer the same kind of feedback a traditional wheel would, meaning drivers couldn't feel the road in the same way. This wasn't just confusing, it could be dangerous. By the 1970s, even the engineers admitted that maybe they twisted things a little too far with this one. It's hard to imagine anything spookier than a seatbelt that only wraps around your neck. But that's precisely what car manufacturers toyed with back in the 1960s. The logic behind these neck seatbelts was that they could prevent whiplash during a crash by holding the head in place. Instead of securing the torso or waist like today's belts, these neck belts were designed to be a kind of safety scarf, snugly embracing the neck in case of a sudden stop. While this concept had a dash of creativity, it also raised a few serious questions, like what would happen to someone's neck in a real accident. It quickly became clear that the risks far outweighed any potential benefits. In a crash, a neck-only belt would have put a tremendous amount of force on the neck itself. Instead of just saving drivers from whiplash, this setup could lead to neck strain, serious injuries, or death. It comes as no surprise that neck seat belts never made it to the mainstream. While the basic idea of preventing whiplash was spot on, the design itself was, let's just say, a little too close for comfort. By the 1970s, lap and shoulder belts had taken over as the gold standard for safety, leaving neck belts to fade into obscurity, right where they belong. Next on our list is the pop-out windshield. This feature seems like the perfect prop for a James Bond movie. These windshields were designed to pop out in one piece during a crash, creating an easy escape route for passengers trapped inside the car. If you're wondering why, trust me, you're not alone. The reasoning behind it was that if you're in a bad accident, you could kick out the windshield and crawl to safety. Sounds clever, right? Well, not exactly. While the idea was to help drivers and passengers escape, the reality was that pop-out windshields were more dangerous than anyone expected. The last thing you want in a crash is for the windshield to come loose. If a windscreen pops out too easily, it not only fails to protect passengers, but can also make it more likely for people to be ejected from the vehicle. Another problem was the glass itself. In older designs, windshields were made from a more brittle material that shattered on impact. So in a crash, you'd not only lose your protective barrier, but you might also get a face full of sharp glass. Eventually, pop-out windshields were phased out in favor of stronger, laminated glass that stayed in place during accidents. These newer designs were shatter-resistant, offering better protection in crashes and keeping passengers safely inside the car. Today's windshields are a far cry from those early designs. So, we talked about neck-only seatbelts earlier in this video, but the shocking twist to this is the lap-only seatbelts, which seemed to be all the rave in the 1950s. We don't know what it was with car makers and seatbelts in the 19th and early 20th century, but it's clear they were obsessed. Before the 50s, seatbelts weren't even standard equipment, so just having something to keep you from flying through the windshield in an accident felt like a win. These early belts were simple, just a strap across your lap that kept you in place during a collision. However, as safety researchers soon discovered, lap belts had their limitations. While they did prevent people from being ejected from the car, they didn't offer much protection for the upper body. In a crash, the force of the impact would often cause the wearer to jackknife forward, leading to severe injuries like internal bleeding, spinal damage, or even decapitation in extreme cases. The lap belt did its job of keeping you in the car, but it couldn't prevent the rest of your body from suffering in a severe accident. It wasn't until the late 1960s and early 1970s that shoulder belts became more common, providing much-needed upper body protection. The combination of lap and shoulder belts significantly reduced injuries. By the mid-70s, lap-only belts were largely phased out. Next on our list is a hood ornament. There was a time when no luxury car was complete without an eye-catching hood ornament. It quickly became a symbol of elegance, power, and in some cases danger. From Rolls-Royce's graceful Spirit of Ecstasy to Dodge's aggressive Ram, these sculptures added a sense of grandeur to cars of the early to mid-20th century. For some, they were the crown jewels of the automobile world, proudly perched atop the hood like a knight's crest. But while they were undoubtedly stylish, hood ornaments posed a real safety hazard, especially for pedestrians. In the event of a collision, these decorative features could become deadly projectiles, causing serious injury. The sharp edges and solid materials made them a nightmare in even minor accidents. Today, most cars have sleek, minimalist designs that forego the grandiose hood ornaments, opting instead for smooth lines that are far more pedestrian-friendly. Last but not least is the lack of crumple zone. While it might be difficult to believe, crumple zones were not always part of car designs. Earlier, vehicles were built to be as tough as possible. Manufacturers wanted cars to be rigid and durable, which made sense from a structural standpoint. However, this approach led to a serious oversight in terms of safety. In a crash, all that rigidity meant that the force of the impact was transferred directly to the occupants, often with devastating results. The concept of crumple zones was first introduced in the 1950s. These zones were designed to absorb and disperse the energy of a collision, protecting passengers by allowing the car to deform in controlled ways. Rather than resisting the impact, crumple zones allowed parts of the car, like the front and rear ends, to crumple, absorbing the crash energy and reducing the forces transferred to passengers. The introduction of crumple zones not only reduced fatalities, but also changed the psychology behind car design. Safety became a top priority, and the concept of letting the car take the hit became a standard approach. Today, it's hard to imagine a car without crumple zones. They're so integrated into the fabric of automotive engineering that we barely think about them. But they represent one of the most significant shifts in car safety, making rigid frames and their accompanying dangers a thing of the past. Which of these old car features did you find shocking? Let us know in the comment section below. If you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to subscribe and like it. See you in the next one.